Hey LinkedIn, welcome to another LinkedIn Live with myself and my lovely guest, Chris Flack. Now, this is my first LinkedIn Live since I have returned from Tenerife. And so it's a little bit strange to be back doing it on Irish soil. Chris and I actually know each other. We both did a master's in organisational behaviour in DCU. So that's how we know each other. We've been, I guess, fans of each other's work for a few years now. And we always have super interesting conversations. And the podcast, which was out a few weeks ago now at this stage, that Chris and I recorded together was all about unplugging, disconnecting from work. And Chris has some brilliant insights to share in relation to that. Chris, do you want to kind of give an intro of yourself, your background, and what kind of brought you to where you are?
Sure. Thank you, Aoife. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. I guess just a very brief background as to why I do what I do today. I spent about 10 years working in technology consulting, so in companies like Capgemini, working in areas like big data and data analytics. And during that time, I was a huge fan of technology, and I still am. But back then, and this was around 15 years ago, I was probably one of the first people in my office to be always on, which was quite a long time ago, really. It was quite, I was an early adopter. And a lot of that I found really, really beneficial. I was quickest to respond to the client, quickest to respond to my boss. But over time, it started to have a bit of a detrimental impact on my own well-being and my own productivity. But I'd kind of developed this habit of self-interruption. And it wasn't something I noticed until my next project. So totally unrelated, I decided to change sector and I moved across to the not-for-profit sector. One of my projects was working in India with the amazing NGO WaterAid. And for a lot of that time, I was off the grid. So this was 2011, 2012 in India, whereas rural India, there was no data available. So I'd gone from being this totally always on, immersed in technology guy to very, very little exposure to technology. And, I still had that self-interruption going on. So it's something that I became very aware of as far as my own behavior. And it really impacted me when I then came back to Ireland after about 2 years, saw how quickly I got straight back into technology, but probably more importantly, all of my friends and colleagues that I'd worked previously with here, I just noticed a massive shift in behavior. So I started working with friends who are psychologists and neuroscientists, and that was really the seeds for UnPlug. We built a team from that, showing that if we make some small changes in how we use technology, have a really positive impact on our productivity and our impact and our well-being. So I guess when we set up UnPlug in 2015, for a long time, we were almost just going around telling people what digital well-being was about, because it was almost just like advocacy, because no one really could see the impact. Whereas in the last 2 years, digital demands have gone through the roof. Yeah. It's been an incredible enabler. But even the lexicon of always on, it's on the front cover of Time magazine in 2015 was the iWatch, and it said always on, but yeah, really had it in our mainstream lexicon. Whereas now everyone's like, yeah, we know the benefits of being always on and being able to have that wonderful flexibility within our work. But at the same time, we need to be able to manage the technology and manage the culture around how we use technology so that we can really thrive in this always on world. And that's what we do now.
Yeah. Chris, can you explain to me what you mean by self-interruption? Because you were saying that in the context of technology, but also not with technology as well.
Yeah, so this it kind of comes down to the concept of what's called task switching. So we touched on this a little bit within the chat we had. I think for the majority of us growing up, we might have always thought we could multitask, and we can do that physically. But what the science shows us...
I still think that, Chris.
Of course, we can do it physically.
No, I'm learning.
Cognitively, we can't. We only have one process. The first time multitasking was actually coined as a term was in a mainframe computer by IBM in 1967. All right, so computers can do that, but we can't. Yeah. But what technology encourages us to do is task switch very, very quickly. Yeah. And when we get into the habit of doing that, it kind of a micro habit might just be, from notifications, ping, ping, ping. And over time, that becomes a macro habit, and we're checking our phone when we're driving. We're checking our phone when we're reading our child a bedtime story. We never plan to do those things. But it's a self-interruption. And I was definitely, even in 2011, I was at that stage where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I was like, why am I awake? Like, I've got really good sleep hygiene. I have a lavender thing on my pillow, I kind of wound down. And it was because my body had this expectation of a self-interruption. And that's just gone into override for everybody now, because technology has become so much more important, especially when we were in full lockdown. It was our only way to keep in contact, not just with work, but with people really important to our lives. Yeah. So, yeah, it's become, I think, a key challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah. It's like a form of distraction almost, is it? That you're kind of getting distracted because of, and I know on the podcast we talk about these external versus internal triggers that we have in relation to technology. The external being exactly as you said, like notifications that pop up. And I have done experiments. I typically will have my phone switched to do not disturb for a lot of the day, actually. But it almost has the opposite effect, because I'm checking my phone then see, oh, I wonder did any message come through? And if I have it on silent and I hear a buzz, then I know that there's a message there waiting for me, but I don't necessarily have to check it immediately. It's kind of almost like the opposite that what you might expect.
It is. And I think it's the thing that for me really has the most impact as far as people seeing that it's possibly a challenge in their own life is when they start to review and have that awareness of how they use technology. So I was working with a leadership team in the last week, and two of the leaders actually said within the call, so one of my big challenges is I am checking my Slack channel whilst reading my children bedtime stories. And then from that, you can see, okay, well, look, the reason I'm doing this is because continuously I'm checking every single channel I have throughout the day and then throughout the weekend. And that's basically creating that habit of self-interrupt.
Yeah.
And sometimes we do need to do that. But I think this always on culture that we have now is really kind of, it's grown because we've never sat down and said, you know what, we do need to check Slack throughout the day, but maybe at night, we don't need to check it. We just need to check one channel, maybe text message. If there's an emergency, if we do need to check Slack, a message goes out on text saying, guys, there's a critical client issue, let's check Slack. Whereas what we're doing now is we're checking every single channel all of the time.
If there's anything,
just to see if we might have that, whether it could just be an Amazon delivery notification, or it could be, something important about work, something important with our family, but we're checking everything all the time. And that's the whole idea of us being in control versus the technology controlling us. That's where that self-interruption and kind of the extreme of that then is where it hits things like health and safety. So there's the kind of the funny version of it was the BAFTAs, sorry, not the BAFTAs, the Oscars 3 or 4 years ago, where the wrong envelope was handed because someone was checking their phone, right? Whereas the dark side of health and safety is when, I think it's like you're 4 times more likely to have a crash when you're texting whilst driving. And so many people, not that it's the right thing to do, but they don't plan to do that. It's just that they're just busy and the resources might be low. So that's the only time they can do it. But typically a self-interruption. You wouldn't plan during your day to check your email whilst driving. A funny bug that I have, and this is me just being a grumpy old man. So I belong to a gym just for the sauna, right? Just for the sauna. I love sauna.
Okay. Yeah.
I love ice to sauna. It's one of my buzzes. And people are checking their phones in the sauna.
Wow. You would think that might damage the technology slightly?
Well, I think most of the new technology is pretty good when it comes to kind of resistant. I don't know about the heat now, but for me, another subject we talked about within our chat on the podcast, Aoife, was this idea of psychological detachment, right?
Yeah.
We have parts of our life where we can actually give our brain the chance to recharge, to defrag, essentially.
Sauna being one of them.
Yeah, and it's that whole thing of, you go to the sauna and it's almost like, would you bring in your laptop? No. And yet people are there. And because, unfortunately, what I do, and I get quite grumpy in the sauna, I'm kind of looking across and I can see it's work email, right?
Yeah.
It's the whole thing of, but this is the time. I get that if there's an emergency, absolutely fine. But they're doing it every day, all the time. And because of that, then it's always on, it's self-interruption. Even when they plan to have an intimate romantic dinner with their partner or, spend really nourishing quiet time with the kids, they're checking their phone.
Is there. Yeah. And I know we talked specifically about the iPhone effect, Chris, you had mentioned. And before I go on to that, I want to give a shout out to Simon Hodgkins, who's saying he's agreeing with you there, Chris, saying there's so many channels, like there's so many different modes of communication that you can be checking, that it's pretty scary. So the iPhone effect that we talked about, even when it's on the table, but it's turned over, you can't see it. It still has that kind of draw for us that we want to check it, or, there's this kind of thing. What I will say about I'm a huge Apple advocate. I have no problem with that. I love my iPhone, absolutely. They brought out something a few years ago where it automatically could detect when you were driving and it would switch it to do not disturb while you're driving. So you couldn't actually check your text, and so you'd have to kind of physically go in, and you weren't getting notifications while you were driving, basically. Um,
Yes.
you can turn that on or you can turn it off, and now they have kind of different modes for the do not disturb. Like there's personal, there's sleeping, there's lots of these different things. There's also a weekly notification that I get that says, oh, congratulations, or I don't even think it says congratulations, it just says your use of your phone has increased by, and I think the first time I got it, it said 5 hours, and I thought 5 hours in a week, that's pretty good going. I would have thought it was a bit more than that, but and then I realized it was actually 5 hours on average per day, and it really scared me a lot.
Wow.
And it kind of fluctuates from week to week depending on what I'm doing. And these days I'm doing Duolingo, and I'm kind of spending a little bit more time brushing up on my Spanish. I'm increasing the amount of time I'm using it, which means I'm increasing the amount of time I'm using my phone. But I do try and build in that time to step away and not have my phone with me. So maybe we can talk about some of the strategies that people could use in their own lives day to day to kind of to manage that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so ¿qué asombroso in relation to your Espanol? But I just, when you mentioned Duolingo, I think one thing that we all need to remember is there is so much that's on our phone that's good, right? And it's almost
exactly.
I know we maybe touched on this in the call before, but the idea of almost looking at it like food, there's certain things, and we touched last time about the Tiger King, right? That is probably quite high sugar, high fat content. Whereas things like Duolingo or collaborative work that we're doing with colleagues, that's a lot more the greens. But having everything in moderation and having that awareness. But I think the awareness is key. It's that whole thing that people want to often rush to the solution. And we've had this really interesting thing we've done in our keynotes recently. We've changed our keynotes because although people have been really enjoying them, they're like, well, look, we want to see more solutions and less talking about the awareness and the why. We introduced a change. So what we did was 5 minutes into the talk, we'd say, have you multitasked since this talk started? And it would be between 90 and 99%, right? But then we'd go into the understanding of like, here's the key citations of research as to what the impact is here. Here's the so what, essentially, right? The kind of science.
Something that you're doing right now. And as people are watching live or on the replay, they could be out with their phone, they could be checking something else at exactly the same time. I want to give a shout out to Aparna Shukla. She said she leaves her phone in the home office and it works to stay away from distractions during family times. That's one trick that she uses. And Simon has given you another shout out saying about defragging, and it's a great point and a great term to use. The brain needs to defrag.
Yeah, good to hear. And just back to that polling. So we poll 5 minutes in with that question, then we give them the why, the impact, right? And then we ask again, and genuinely it's minimal 20% less. And it's that whole, okay, guys, because you understand the why, now you're changing, as opposed to just going, here's an app or here's this, and jumping onto the solution without actually understanding what is my own impact here? How is this impacting me personally? Feeling that, which is so important. It all comes down to, there's a cognitive bias that I think we mentioned last time, the IKEA effect, which shows that if we build something, we typically like it more. And the same is true of our habits. If we actually diagnose them and understand, okay, well, I use Duolingo a lot, but you know what? It's actually a really good use for my time. And at least I'm aware as to how much I'm using it, and I've capped it. Whereas if we don't have that and we just jump onto the solution, quite often we find ourselves not using the solutions.
No, that's a really great point, Chris. And it's, if you're checking your stats on your phone and it's saying something like it's mostly Facebook and Instagram, or even if it's email and texting and stuff like that, maybe it's need to have a look and understand exactly what you were saying, the impact that it's having on you personally, rather than sorry, getting a bit of sun in my eyes there. The sun is finally shining here in Dublin. But yeah, really, really interesting point, I think. Anything else just in terms of wrapping things up for today? Anything else to share? For anyone who hasn't listened to the full episode of the podcast, there is a link to the full episode in the comments below. This is just kind of us doing a bit of a recap, a bit of a live discussion about some of the points that came up on the podcast as well.
I think one thing that you just touched on there is really important, for the idea of personal responsibility. And not just, being aware as to what we're using, but also then the fact that technology is systemic and how is that impacting other people. So if I'm sending emails in the middle of the night, even if I've got a thing that's at the bottom of my email saying, I don't expect you to reply to this. There's a low and they're trying to get a promotion, or they're new in the organization, you might well be encouraging their habit, which then potentially becomes a self-interruption for them.
Mm.
Obviously, then we also need guardrails from organizations to help us manage that personal responsibility. And that's the idea of digital culture. And I know there's a lot of organizations now in Ireland, a number of which we work with, around the likes of team charters, which came really out of the back of the Rights Disconnect in France, where a lot of organizations looked to the Rights Disconnect, said, okay, this is great, but we actually need structures around how we have shared values and norms in how we use different platforms. So Simon's feedback earlier about we have so many platforms, but have we ever actually sat down and said, okay, what do we really use these for? What is priority number one? Right, what's the one that, if there's a fire, we need to check that one? And how frequently do we check the others? And we've never really talked about that, whereas these communication and team charters are a good way to start that.
Yeah. No, that's a really good. Any kind of parting thoughts that you want to share with anyone? Like I said, if anyone hasn't listened to the full episode, there is a link in the notes below. It's one of the shorter episodes, I think, maybe 35 or 40 minutes. So for anyone who hasn't listened to the full episode, it's there, and we go into a lot more detail on some of the points that we covered today.
Yeah, I guess another part would be something like peer motivation, that quite often people look at things, and as you said earlier, when you first looked at that 5 hours a day, you're like, whoa, this is, whereas when, we're sharing it on here, all of a sudden it's like, I've discussed this. And I think quite often we can be challenged with self-compassion when it comes to behavior change. So it's the whole thing that we're all in this. Every single organization we work with, they look at how much their employees are using technology out of office hours. And people are horrified. It's like, but look, we're all doing this, right? This is a challenge that isn't just, it's not age old. We're pioneers here.
There's very few people that are immune from that.
Exactly. Having the awareness and actually discussing it is key. But if you can start discussing it with colleagues and friends and family is always a funny one, because people are always like, well, my other half, it's their thing. I'm fine with technology. But then when you sit down and you actually discuss it, it can be a little bit of a different thing.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your earlier point, and we'll kind of wrap things up with this. You were saying about the master, and I know Gretchen Rubin has a really great phrase that escapes me right now about being let technology be, like you be the master of the technology rather than it controlling you, that you're the one that gets to decide, and you're the one who can set your notifications and your time limits and all of that kind of stuff. I think it's really been important. So thank you everyone who tuned in live today or who is watching the replay. And thank you so much, Chris, for your time today. Always love chatting with you. You have so many insights to share. So really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Aoife. Great to be here. And thanks to everyone for being here as well. Thank you.